A bright and vibrant game world critics and outraged YouTubers say you should never buy. That it's irredeemable, damned, cursed, not just killed, but murdered. Old BioWare is dead, spouted PC Gamer. I've just got done reading a book called When, The Science of Timing and When It Matters, and Anthem is yet another example of the research extrapolated in that book. Anthem, compared justifiably at every turn to Destiny, is not Destiny. The incorrect comparison that outright doesn't sync is that Anthem is Destiny 1 at launch. I suppose, in the context of When, this is only human. We rely on assumption and put a loaded value into that assumption, especially in this speed-of-light industry moving faster all the time. The history of individual games and the impact they had on the business at large is forgot. For example, I've recently listened to IGN spout that they hope Borderlands is able to capture some of what Overwatch was able to do. However, without Borderlands, there is no Overwatch. Without Borderlands, there is no Destiny. Without Destiny, there is no Overwatch. Each of these FPS have spawned in turn their sort of mutant next of kin. Borderlands creates the hero shooter as we'll come to know it, streamlined in Destiny. No game is published in a vacuum, which is only one aspect of the criticism I find faulty with Anthem. It isn't doing justice to the developers who spent all their time and effort on this game, or doing due diligence as a journalist without looking at where the game falls within the scope of its place within video game history. Not in a grandiose way, but in a linear fashion. What are Anthem's inspirations? Where do these design elements come from? And ultimately, what's holding this game back? Because seemingly forgot is just how bare bones Destiny 1 was, and further the length of the content droughts fans endured. Comparing Destiny 1 on the cusp of its sequel is unfair, for after 5 years of development, the game had become the contender we know it as. In many ways, a cutting-edge and pioneering game. So I find a direct comparison to Destiny Vanilla largely inaccurate, as it's not based on true vanilla Destiny, because typically, the memory of the game is forgotten to the latest patch, albeit with one slight exception. Anthem is increasingly leaning towards Destiny's live service model that I found unethical from the beginning, the video game equivalent of renting an Adobe product. In the book When, researchers conduct a battery of tests around the science of timing. In one experiment, researchers asked people to rate chocolates and found that by telling people that this is their last chocolate to taste, it doubles how people score the piece of chocolate on average. However, these are identical pieces of chocolate from beginning to end. Chocolate that's a 5 when just given to a testee is a 7 to a person told that this is going to be their last piece of chocolate. The same thing happens in other tests. This lesson, backed up with other tests involving math quizzes and jams, etc., all involve the exact same principle, that people will weight things based upon their context, not in an objective way like chocolate just tastes better, but based upon that chocolate's place in the moment. Seemingly random events like your patience with a test or the taste of chocolate can be influenced by the strangest but most logical of patterns. This research ties into the Nobel Prize-winning Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, which showed an array of examples in behavioral research that were not as logical as we like to think, that we are still largely driven by primitive equipment, intuition, blood glucose levels, etc. But in many ways, this is a good thing, as our survival and mental acuity depend upon it. Judges before they ate, after they ate, saw a dramatic increase in paroles granted, for example, in Israel from Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Testees given an impossible math test after given chocolate would work twice as long at it than testees required to resist chocolate. Some testees even growing angry at having been forced to resist the chocolate. And that's from When. Now, what does this have to do with Anthem? In comparing it to Destiny, the rosy portrait of Bungie's admittedly strong finish takes precedent over the barren state of Destiny's launch. A disjointed, oft poorly written campaign, a crude and poorly designed power cap system that relied on RNG and time gates to slow the roll of many players. If someone is sitting in their chair thinking, this asshole should shut up with this bullshit, tell me you didn't experience some Randy getting taken through Vault of Glass for his first time, getting every drop and reaching max light level whilst you sat on your 25th raid with not one piece of gear, but an Atheon's epilogue to show for it. This is just one of the many problems that Anthem simply doesn't have at launch. The truncated class system is also shed here for 4 distinct javelins. That's right, 4, with more reportedly on the way, something Destiny in 7 years as a franchise has not been able to reach yet, which when outfitted in all 6 component slots are uniquely your own. Where Destiny had a distinct class system, it was also shallow. Yes, a Warlock is considerably different than a Titan or a Titan to a Hunter, but the difference between your Gunslinger Hunter and my Arc Strider doesn't amount to much beyond an ultimate. The way you can differ is with the one equipable exotic slot that will provide some unique passive. It's not an awful system, in fact it's been very successful obviously, but it is simplistic and it's stat light by design because of Destiny's need to balance for PvP. Because Anthem has stripped away this requirement, Anthem allows several masterworks and legendaries into a build all of your own choosing, then allows a fluid subclass system depending upon what equipable skills you take into the field. The same concept of people adding a subjective view of time into their decision making could tie into Division 2 reviewing just so well. Solid as the game is, it's possible that Anthem's poor reviews and basic internet agreeance that it wasn't up to the expectations made Division 2 look that much better in comparison. Anthem is 2 games in one, and of the many things that Anthem is for both good and bad, this is the one thing about it that is the most jarring. Anthem is Mass Effect. Fort Tarsis is the Normandy. The combat is Andromeda. Mass Effect is one of the essential role-playing franchises for a reason, and its core loop work. Missions, side missions, interesting stories, and once the big plot point of that chapter resolves itself, it's on to the next one, with the gang in the ship having a good old Trekkian conversation. There's multiple reasons this works. There is weight to the conversation, as your choices reflect an eventual outcome and varied feelings of your crew members. You're playing a game that is defining multiple outcomes for your endgame. It's a fundamental loop in every role-playing game and across storytelling. Action, reaction, scene, character, settings, motivation, disaster, sequel, emotion, analyze, new plan, into scene once more. In Destiny, it's the tower after a raid. In Fallout, it's Megaton, then later your settlements, now your camp. For Anthem, it's Fort Tarsis. But something is missing from the loop that I can't quite get my finger on. Some middle thing, some missing element. See, I don't mind the first person thing because I think it helps elevate how much speed and verticality your javelin makes you feel when you do eventually get into it. It offers a frame of reference that heightens the combat. In fact, I don't think combat would be as praised as it is if not for the element of going into first person in Fort Tarsis, because combat can get sloppy. To be fair, it's more good than bad. There's even moments of greatness in there, but I'd be remiss if I claimed 100% I knew what was happening on screen all the time and didn't get lost in the flurry of particle effects and elemental elements and often do something cool or stupid I felt I had no control over, or flew upside down and went side to side and the screen started to shake and then I was frozen. And also, don't get me started on Titans. Perhaps it's the random characters that show up. Characters that are well voiced, carry interesting dialogue, as contrasted with Halleck and Faye, even Owen, and the leaders of the different factions, where I did find myself interested in their tales to a degree. I believe the biggest thing throwing this loop off from being satisfying is the pacing. Missions can be as short as 5 or 10 minutes, and then it's back to the tower through a long loading screen for more sluggish movement and dialogue, throwing the game out of whack because this element feels totally separate from the high-flying combat. It presents complications with the game's strength in being co-op, as your friends just aren't present, and bringing them in requires muting of microphones and meeting up after a while to see if everyone's completed their dialogue choices, then loaded into the forge, then had the leader choose from which mission everyone's is available, and this can lead to confusion as the main story arc becomes non-linear as progression continues. Then they are ready, then the leader readies, then launch expedition, then ready again and launch expedition. Your team laughs and bowls through 10 minutes of fun, then back to the fort to do it all over again, once again divided through a long loading screen, and you can repeat this process. Now, I wrote this before many patches that have somewhat alleviated this. You can now access the forge from wherever you go, but most of this is still intact in Fort Tarsis. As they've streamlined this system more, Fort Tarsis has felt more jarring. Now, I said that the first-person camera to me adds to the combat because it does, but it's especially in those early moments and when this game first launched, being in the long loading screen into Fort Tarsis would be, you're at a 10 out of 10, you're flying around, you're killing lots of enemies, and you're having a ball, and then long loading screen and back in the fort for very slow pacing. And this up, down gives it a bipolar feel and lulls a player to sleep, much like hot and cold weather will. Borderlands 1 presented a much smoother loop and a much smoother multiplayer experience back in 2009. Creating an instance-based open world game where there's hubs, still with stuff to shoot but mostly for questing and digging into menus, which is always a button to press away, where your friends can jump in or out at any time and have their progress carry over or not. The gameplay is cemented in every level up, new weapon or chapter completed, and never stops moving or jars the player with more needless button pressing and menus. To be fair, this was BioWare's first crack at co-op, but so was Gearbox's Borderlands. And while the servers have been mostly stable, the ease of use is just lacking here. Where and when the systems should shine is after you whip through the Destiny 2-esque mandatory story before the end game and start doing dungeon crawls, is to fly right into another mission, as after you've completed the main thrust of the story, all that's left to you is the grind. And so the grind should be seamless, easy, little Little should get in the way of the player completing the fundamental actions that the game is asking them to do to level up and power up. The system has improved since launch, as you can queue back in, but not without going into the ready up screen again. However, this middleman now feels seemingly mandatory, as the vault limit remains at 250 and most endgame javelins are on the edge of that after 6 months of strongholds. I believe we should warp back into the launch bay. Our trophies can be around our platform, as they are currently in Fort Tarsus around the freelancers area, instead of taking you back to Fort Tarsus where you navigate more loading screens and menus to get back into the freedom of your javelin. Further, I'm disoriented within the story and the greater world that my javelin takes up a city square and there's welders always around it, as if I'm the only javelin in the world, but everything and everyone else playing suggests otherwise. I think the launch bay should be the default, and this leads into Fort Tarsus, which is just the same without the suit. The suit being in a garage, Forza Gran Turismo style, which is what the game is offering with its abundance and commendable customization options. Options that worry me, as the game has been unduly criticized for its connection to EA. EA published the game, yes, they own BioWare. You can't have your hand without your arm. Anthem is offering free DLC, no pay to win, no loot boxes. In fact, this is where the system worries me. Considering the current news cycle crying outrage on Anthem's physical sales, these cosmetic only sales might not be enough to sustain it, and then the situation could grow worse as, like Fallout 76, BioWare is forced to go back on its promises. All the same, I still don't understand why one freelancer javelin is the center of attention in a city with 3 different factions, namely the Sentinels, who also wear suits. Whereas if I went into a garage that had a mechanic, here you can add dialogue and a character, even let us hire a person, just like the Cypher, and saw other players' javelins on display being worked on and also in the same area, and there was a forge and it displayed gear and stats in this seamless way, I'd be much more immersed, and I'd feel less jarred going from the fast, fluid combat to the slow pace of the fort. It's cool they added the launch bay. It's cool that they added the launch bay, but they're not using it as they could be using it. As I say, like a Forza Gran Turismo garage with lots of javelins on display, your stats, a forge near you, a mechanic near you, so that everyone could show off and compete and be around one another, so it feels more like the javelins really are this fighter skill kind of thing, rather than where it's at, which is bare bones. It's tacked on. These things add up to a much larger distortion of there being 2 games in one that struggle to reconcile with one another. There's the traditional BioWare game with a better and more grounded lore than Destiny has yet to create, lots of life, and some applaudable decisions to have conversation wheels, and Fort Tarsus grow with your actions. And this is either limited by or limits the Borderlands-esque shoot-'em-up co-op romp the other side of the game is offering. The side of the game that they should lean the hardest into is the Borderlands-esque shoot-'em-up romp, however. This other side that, for all its merits, including an excellent flying option that is remarkably smooth, should be the focus. Even here, where things are at their best in Anthem, there's bumps in the road. Gunplay steps up in the late game with better guns, but the audio sounds like a cross between an N64 game and a squirt gun. Enemies get hefty and their shields, along with their shield recharge rate, can be obnoxiously tanky, whilst you will always, no matter the class, be at risk of an instant death to snipers of the classic video game mechanic of a giant AoE Nova. This, combined with the flying mechanics I mentioned earlier, which are usually great, but which often have too many effects going on at once, too much distortion and blur and elemental pop-ups, means that you can die and really feel like there's nothing tangible that you could have done, or even a way to explain just how you got yourself killed. Titans used to be awful about this. However, they have fixed those considerably, so I won't dig into that part of this review. Enemies are at their best when they reach the scales of Titans and Ursics, and later, Fiends. Enemy javelins are well sized. However, humanoid enemies like Scabs and Dominion can look like ants, and you'll find hundreds upon hundreds of the same models of Scabs, Dogs, Outlaws over and over again. I found the Dominion beast specific out of scale, a sort of cross between a giant creature and the ant humanoids. The scaling is another element in Anthem, feeling like a collage of different ideas and different games forced into a sandwich which has tasty elements. The combat of Sweet Ham is tasty, the wheat bread story is working, and the lore it was baked in adds flavor, but then some soy sauce and a radish found their way in, and the sandwich was served anyways, which we've now learned after I wrote this initial review from the Polygon article that was largely because after 7 years and millions of dollars wasted, they came to a point whether it was either get it done or cancel the game. Then there is the game design, which is so frustrating in its missed opportunities. Anthem is the ingredients of a BioWare story-driven game in Fort Tarsus. Then it's Andromeda with even more polish. Then neither of these things got mixed, let alone baked. Now, 6 months post-launch, BioWare Austin is doing their best to let us almost forget all about Fort Tarsis altogether, which, if resulting in the open world game with seamless dungeons, strongholds, and events from their initial showing at E3 in 2017, will have been greatly to the game's benefit. However, one cannot think that had either they focused on Fort Tarsis or the open world action RPG game from moment one, there wouldn't be the abortion at hand of either of these things. And ultimately, in leaving Fort Tarsis behind, I can hear calling from afar the last siren song of classic BioWare, the so-called BioWare magic for storytelling that has simply failed to be married wholly with modern combat demands. These two cannot seem to coexist. So dies what we knew of BioWare, and so goes a few $1 million and years lost trying to develop two games at the same time. Gone with many others to the EA graveyard. No game on the market currently spouts the fluidity, speed, and scope of Anthem's combat. BioWare has managed to marry the power fantasy with challenge. Granted, they did this by putting massive health bars in the way, but all the same, no game that I've played or know allows one to feel quite as powerful as Anthem. Something Anthem excels in above other games, as even mighty Borderlands 2 becomes a hamster wheel of grinding to reach the same place and bottlenecking characters to near identical builds, or Destiny with its terminal love affair for the Nerf hammer. Anthem places an emphasis on power fantasy and scale. Whether it's the first time falling from 300 feet, doing a backflip, somersaulting and then backstabbing an Ursix, and machine pistoling off the steaming corpse, or it's that special moment when you pull a shield out with a Colossus and dive bomb a sniper with a bone-crunching football tackle. The moment-to-moment combat is bar none. Here, 6 months later, is what still works, and they've thankfully continued with routine adding of equipment and buffs. This too was Anthem's saving grace when EA's patience for Anthem's development hell broke. This combat saved the game's development then, it saved the game 6 months ago at launch, and still, a javelin feels massively powerful and crushing enemies under combos and Anthem's increasingly unique loot, like an earthquake-inducing melee weapon, or Tesla arc-inducing marksman rifles, that it saves the game now. It's this combat that, despite the game's lengthy issues, that keeps me still playing and returning. Seeing my friend Waltz the Grim complete a fire grenade build on his ranger pre-buff and become a flying napalm bomb. Seeing my friend Shadow float above the crowd and create an ice mage that could pour Forever Winter from his palm while reaping 50k a shot out of a machine pistol. Seeing my friend Show the Reaper being a Colossus embedded in the middle of a dense spider nest, pouring violent and spreading flames from a torch over the eggs, then having their defenders pour out and popping an orbiting lightning strike that strikes their burning corpses to the sound of that sweet always plays out to that satisfying ting, and it's special and unique to Anthem. But of course, in true Anthem fashion, this is doubly consternating when related to just how much of the game currently falls flat, how much this combat is hamstrung by disjointed and slow story, how much this combat is meaningless because unlike Diablo or Borderlands or Destiny, the loot just doesn't matter yet, and only Gearscore does, how much this combat can become repetitive, unrewarding, and both feel and be useless. This is a role-playing game that even with the cataclysms, and even with more loot dropping than ever, just fails to offer either narrative progress or weight to actions through story consequence, and or a meaningful system of power and progression outside of just collecting the highest gear score through repetition. I've heard many reviewers say things that don't feel as if they have adequately explored the game's systems. Criticism that the world doesn't feel alive or feels empty is a blatant misstatement at the face of it. I've watched a butcher cutting up a bloody thigh while patrons talked about gambling debts and the oldest man in Fort Tarsis, while flies swarmed around and trinkets danced in the wind. These reviewers rushed the main story. Side missions, dialogue, and contracts begin to restore faith in the denizens of Fort Tarsis and bring the economy online again, which in turns bring the fort to life. That, as I said, remains the siren call of old BioWare and what could have been. As my friend Shadow said, anyone who says this game doesn't feel alive just hasn't spent the time to make it feel alive, which is the truth, and this game has garnered unduly harsh reviews, on often either bad logic or faulty information. As I just described, Anthem isn't perfect. I don't know what game is. However, having played Fortnite Save the World, I know what a game with a mirage of mangled and half-implemented design looks like. There's a short history of that game's development on this channel, and many things described in that video are issues old versions of the game had fixed and are now being fixed again, and which will likely go back and forth for an indeterminate amount of time. Meanwhile, Fortnite BR will continue to rake in millions and millions of dollars. An example of this with Fortnite Save the World is the Hero Update. The Hero Update brings the game more in line with the way that it used to be. Many people hate it. They'll likely revert it again. And so it goes with these live service games. Save the World specifically relates to Anthem when I hear people, critics, reviewers say that Anthem's flaws are deeply woven into its core or baked in. And I find this statement also without much merit or argument. This gets stated, it sounds good. I mean, deeply woven sounds nice. Then once stated, they forget the importance of describing how and why. What exactly does that mean baked in? What exactly does that mean deep to the core of the game? It's easy to say this and then not to explain what they mean by the core system. As I've mentioned in this review, I feel that the gameplay loop, shooting and looting, is missing something in between and is jarred by the addition of Fort Tarsus. Or say what I felt about Save the World, at its core of being an instance-based game with time gates and many levels to each of its levels of progression, just added a redundancy, and ultimately with the addition of its loot boxes and daily caps and hard caps, etc., made it feel like a mobile game that I paid $200 for. This, thankfully, is just not true of Anthem. Anthem has a level cap of 30, and then like Destiny and Division, moves on to power level, which is a soft cap equated to gear score, and then that's it. I don't feel that the core of the game is fundamentally broken, it's just extremely shallow. I take my time with these opinions. I try to get all the achievements. I don't rush it. I see it through. I was still stewing my thoughts and opinions as the Stream Gang came into patch 1.04. The Anthem cycle has been one we've become accustomed to. A live service game is pushed out as minimum viable product in true design philosophy fashion. It struggles, lowering initial reviews and opinions. Then, with the reality that their initial impression has been lost, the developers put their heads down, crafted into something reasonable within a year, and organize a relaunch in some form. I wish the developers would still follow the Minecraft model. Discount a beta, which is a lifetime license, then after the beta, the proper $60 release. The game will be discounted when it amounts to the price ceiling and a minimum resale price maintenance of $60. The philosophy is logical. It's why it's so often repeated. The product, idea, model, whatever, it gets prototyped and gets created. The most important thing is the rough draft, the actual fulfillment of the idea, something that can only be done with a trial by fire. The issue is the trial by fire is still following the old model of $60. The issue is that the new software development philosophy is still following the old price model, which is fine for a fully developed game, but should we be paying that for a game that almost always is in the midst of its development? A pet peeve of mine, why are digital games not discounted? We know that the markup exists in the store so that the store can profit, but in this case there's no packaging, stocking, shipping necessary. Games like Anthem or Fallout 76 or Fortnite Save the World are using the most up-to-date thinking on software and design. Prototype your ideas, realize them in actuality, and then as they get tested and worked upon, make them into something better using real-world data. Publishers, however, are not using up-to-date thinking. They're still trying to use the same tried and true method of selling video games we've used for 30 years. If you think Division 2 is exempt from this, Division 2 had 5 years on its predecessor to figure out their game too. Division 2 looks better again because for confounded issues Destiny 2 didn't. Now that tells you how fast this industry works, because in this review are many statements involving Division 2 which had reviewed so well when it first came out and is now ostensibly dead in the water for the time being because people soured on it quickly. And while things have been dead in the water for Division 2, we're here with Anthem 6 months later. Their largest patch has just gone through in the form of the Cataclysm update, and it's doing away with the luck system. But I'm left largely in the same position, and so are the rest of us. Live service games are nigh impossible to review. What we've seen is that they launch as prototypes at best, but advertised as completed projects just getting started with their greatness. Anthem is in a precarious position as EA can see the investment has failed, and this is far from the realm of possibility. EA will outlive us. The corporation goes on. We'll eventually forget about Anthem. Anthem is in a dying state. The outrage mob has moved on, which was better to have them than what we're left with currently. Deafening silence. Outrage is at least buzz, and like many a dying game, there is no buzz nor the inclination towards buzz. They're hiring, they're transitioning their development, they're still updating the game, they seem to have their heads down and they're working on it. In fact, my prediction is that they're moving towards a game more in line with the 2017 trailer, to have a more open world style game that does have dynamic interaction with strongholds and missions, and it feels more like a shared and alive game world, and with the people that they've hired, that they're moving to a much stronger stronger and robust role-playing game, more in line with Diablo or Borderlands, where the loot matters and there's post-story progression that's meaningful, and they have a studio that knows what they're doing. BioWare Austin turned Knights of the Old Republic into one of the great MMORPGs. They know how to do this thing. They have the experience if EA will let them do it, because the question now becomes, is there time enough, money enough, and interest enough? And if there is, will they be able to patch the game enough, quickly enough, to become another No Man's Sky or Destiny? Because the idea of a No Man's Sky patch gets mentioned as if the production of one guarantees the end result, success. Your game comes back. 3 hip hip hoorays for the live service model, it works. Destiny and No Man's Sky both had epic levels of promise and buzz generated, fell flat on their face, and then patched their game into the software that people wanted to play and felt as if they were at least somewhat achieving what they had promised. Destiny and No Man's Sky both had epic levels of promise and buzz generated. And I think ultimately, as they fell on their face and then patched their way to being at least remotely what they promised, people came back to those games because they wanted to still play those games. They really believed in the idea and the high concepts behind those games. And the question becomes just how much gamers want to see Anthem reach its potential. It doesn't have the cult following that say Fallout. Fallout fans, there's a reason that ZeniMax is charging $800 for a jacket, and they know they can get away with it. They've got a cult following that remains through and through Fallout fans. Anthem as a new IP doesn't have the same benefit. I think it's a possibility that Anthem could produce that No Man's Sky patch, and maybe not even in one patch, but over the course of the next 6 months going into the 1-year anniversary, patch itself into something like that 2017 trailer and still die because of lack of interest. There is yet to be a patch with Anthem that hasn't brought the game to a better state, and yet still we see the player base flailing, flagging off. We players wanted a social hub akin to Destiny's Tower, and we got it with the launch bay. Granted, now it seems hardly ever used, and it requires some busy work to get to it, but they did deliver it. We wanted a way to get cosmetics without using embers. They gave us the Elysium keys through dailies as an answer. We wanted higher drop rates. They continue to give this in squirts and doses through almost every patch, and many changes to GM2 and 3, and a contentious point that many old school RPG players would make is that the drop rates were fine, while many argued that they were as dry as the Nevada desert, and there was very little in between. Now, I would argue in favor of both of these people. I think that the drop rates were very low, and I think that's okay if you're offering a system of progress outside of the drop rates. If you're either your javelin is still continuing to get more powerful, or you're collecting materials or keys or whatever, that you can mechanically write the effects of RNG on yourself. In other words, turn all that what would seem like wasted time into a good use of your time because you still ended up with what you needed. I would also say that a player truly needs growth in any modern role-playing game. Right now they have an XP bar that doesn't amount to a hill of beans, and I think it would be wise at the very least to start having that XP bar build small bonuses parallel to, say, Borderlands Badass Rank or Diablo's Paragon. Also, being able to farm specific enemies for a specific loot is quickly becoming an industry standard, and Anthem is at the mercy of a strictly RNG system. So this has caused another problem systematic of Anthem, which is gear score is all that matters. So all I need to do is get my legendaries, and I'm not looking for anything to really build a special build or anything like that. I just want my legendaries. So I'm going to run strongholds. Okay, well, everyone pretty much agrees that the latest stronghold was probably the best stronghold. It was at least the most complete, had plenty of mechanics, it was interesting, but it also takes the longest, so there's no point in doing it. Why not just run the spider mine or go and kill the monitor in 5 minutes over and over again, because you're just spinning the slot machine. The biggest thing to me limiting the game right now, just how little depth is there once you scratch under the surface of the end game a little bit, and of Anthem in general, which is all the more disappointing in just how good it could be, how fun that combat would be if you could mix it with a great RPG. So in conclusion, for the time being, the game continues to improve and grow, and we'll see some patches, and whether they can draw people in or not will really determine whether or not they can churn the fresh dollars needed that EA will allow Anthem to reach some of its potential, and whether Anthem, in the wake of Borderlands 3 and the success of Division and the success of Destiny and the success of now many a looter shooter, whether Anthem can carve out its niche in this market is murky. It's as murky as what live service games are and will be. It's as murky as what a 7 out of 10 even means anymore, and why Anthem gets a 2 out of 3.